1,200 people in the most powerful room in Europe laughed. They laughed at history, at struggle, at an entire continent's pain, wrapped in a polished joke about who owes who. But one man didn't join them. He didn't flinch. He didn't smile. Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, sat still and stared. No words, no retaliation. Just a gaze sharp as truth, heavy as memory. And in that single moment of silence, he did what decades of speeches, protests, and summits failed to do. He turned the narrative upside down. In just 48 hours, alliances were shaken, world leaders were stunned, and millions across Africa and Europe began asking the same question. What does Africa really owe? And to whom? This is not a documentary. It's not a historical record. This is a fictional story, crafted from truths too often ignored. Because while the events are imagined, the emotions, the injustice, and the longing for dignity are very, very real. Welcome to a story where one silent stare shook centuries of silence. It was not a conference, it was a performance. And everyone in the Grand Palais knew it. The chandeliers above didn't just hang, they reigned. Massive crystal crowns dripping with light, suspended like judgment over the velvet-clad delegates below. The walls were mirrors, but they didn't reflect people. They reflected power. Gilded molding curled like golden vines across the ceilings. The air itself seemed rehearsed, perfumed with confidence and centuries of entitlement. This was Paris. This was prestige. This was the Global Forum on Africa's Future, and France was hosting. More than a forum, it was a stage, a theater of power, complete with its own cast, lighting, camera crew, and script. Each seat was assigned, every angle calculated. Even the pauses for applause had been practiced the night before. Ministers, commissioners, CEOs, military attachés, and diplomats sat in careful formation around a crescent-shaped table lined with miniature flags. Red, green, gold, blue, each one waving more politely than the nations they represented. Around the periphery, journalists whispered predictions. Social media managers hovered over devices, ready to clip and post the next soundbite before the speaker even finished saying it. France, as the host, had curated everything, from the seating chart to the menu, from the lighting to the language. And then there was him, not on the stage, not on the program. Ibrahim Traoré, 35 years old, president of Burkina Faso. He sat in the second row behind a pillar just enough to be inconvenient, but not enough to hide him completely. No one had introduced him. No one acknowledged his arrival. And yet, those who noticed him couldn't look away for long. He was younger than most in the room. Not dressed in custom Italian tailoring, but in something simpler, cleaner, sharper in a different way. No entourage, no papers, no device in hand, just stillness, presence, a quiet alertness, like someone listening not only to words, but to what they tried to hide. Some whispered to each other, "Wasn't that the soldier who took power in 2022? Why is he even here? He's not on the speaker list." Burkina Faso? That's a back row country. But his posture said otherwise. While others adjusted their collars, checked their watches, scrolled through carefully phrased notes, Traoré didn't move. His hands were folded, his eyes forward, his gaze calm but unreadable. And as the opening remarks began, scripted, polished, rehearsed to perfection, there was something odd about the air. Not off, but unsettled. As if a violin in an orchestra had gone one note sharp, just enough that no one could relax. That sharpness was him. In a sea of polished performance, his quiet became a crack in the stage floor. The camera panned over the room, passing over generals and CEOs, until it paused, briefly, on the second row. Zoom in. Who's that? The livestream feed caught it. Twitter noticed it. A still frame appeared online. Who is the man not clapping? Most viewers wouldn't realize yet, but they had just seen the face of the man who, by the end of this forum, would shake the foundations of post-colonial diplomacy and change the way Africa looked back at Europe and at itself. But for now, he just sat there, waiting, watching, and already rewriting the script. without saying a word. The lights shifted almost imperceptibly, just enough to signal that the show was truly beginning. The hall stilled. Conversations hushed. All eyes turned to the podium as Roland Dufour, France's Minister of Foreign Affairs, stepped forward with the practiced grace of a man used to commanding attention. At 58, Dufour embodied the polished authority of French diplomacy. Silver hair combed back immaculately, tailored suit hugging him with quiet precision, every gesture as measured as a metronome. He adjusted the microphone with care, smiled with rehearsed humility, and let his voice fill the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we gather not as strangers, but as partners, bound by history, joined by purpose." The words were smooth, almost poetic, wrapped in the tone of a seasoned statesman. Applause followed, soft and timely, just as expected. For the next several minutes, Dufour walked the audience through a carefully choreographed narrative. France, he explained, had been a steadfast ally of Africa, forgiving debts, building infrastructure, educating future leaders. His voice was low and even, persuasive but not pleading. Behind him, a large screen flashed images of bridges, roads, smiling children in school uniforms, the kind of images donors love. And then, almost too casually, the turn came. "We've given so much," he said, letting the words linger. "Restructured loans, shared our universities, opened our markets." A slight pause, the audience leaned in. "And yet," he continued, "some still say we haven't done enough, that our efforts are insufficient, that our commitment is in question." He smiled, not warmly but knowingly. A smile sharpened at the edges, dressed as tolerance but embroidered with irritation. The next line was softer, almost thrown away. "Sometimes I wonder if they remember who built their roads." The laughter was delicate at first, restrained by decorum, but it spread. A ripple of elegant amusement moved through the European side of the room, quiet chuckles blossoming into full, confident laughter. A few African delegates smiled thinly, diplomatically. Others looked down. A camera operator zoomed in instinctively on reactions. It caught Traoré. He didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. While others shifted in their seats or glanced sideways, Ibrahim Traoré stared. Not at Dufour, not at the laughing crowd, but directly into the main broadcast camera. His gaze was unflinching, steady, locked in. It was the kind of look that bypassed the lens and reached the viewer on the other side, whoever they were, wherever they sat. He didn't seem angry. He didn't roll his eyes. There was no tension in his jaw, no clenched fists, just stillness and something else, something deeper, a quiet refusal to play the game. Dufour continued, oblivious to the shift in the room's air. "Africa still owes us," he said at last, his voice rising with a strange mixture of pride and provocation. The laughter swelled again, but the camera remained on Traoré's face. And in that moment, without speaking a single word, without standing or raising his voice, the president of Burkina Faso began to unravel the entire performance, just by choosing not to laugh. The laughter that had rolled through the Grand Palais did not fade so much as freeze in midair, caught by the sudden gravity of a single unblinking gaze. A director in the live broadcast van saw the stillness on his monitor and barked, "Camera 3, tight on the second row." The view snapped from Dufour's triumphant smile to Ibrahim Traoré's face, motionless and unlit by any hint of amusement. In newsrooms across Paris and Lagos and Johannesburg, producers recognized the electricity of the moment and ordered their own close-ups. Within seconds, that calm, steady stare filled screens on 5 continents. Social media feeds, starved for authenticity, erupted. A journalist tweeted a freeze frame. "Find you someone who looks at injustice the way Traoré looks at this room." A Ghanaian influencer added, "The moment you realize colonial jokes aren't funny anymore." Retweets multiplied by the thousands while the minister was still speaking. A trending hashtag, #OneStare, was born before the speech had even ended. Inside the hall, the atmosphere bent and warped. Cameras swiveled away from the podium, their red tally lights beaming like tiny accusations. The delicate choreography France had polished for months began to unravel. The audience's attention was no longer on the speaker, but on the silence in row 2. African heads of state who had worn diplomatic smiles now adjusted their posture, unsure whether to keep up the polite facade or acknowledge the tension prickling across their skin. The president of Niger tapped his pen against his folder, a steady click betraying nerves. Senegal's trade minister offered Traoré a sympathetic glance, but he did not return it. He stared only at the lens, as if every pixel carried history's weight. Dufour, sensing a drift yet oblivious to its scale, pressed on, voice honeyed but shrinking. Each polished line landed with less resonance than the last, dying against an invisible wall of disquiet. Interpreters in glass booths slowed, their eyes flicking to the monitors, translating not just language but a mood they could neither soften nor ignore. What had begun as a celebration of French generosity was transforming in real time into a portrait of arrogance exposed. The forum's script called for polite applause cues. Instead, there were pockets of coughing, a rustle of shifting bodies, the uneasy acoustics of decorum fraying. Traoré's silence expanded, a silent metronome ticking louder than any speech. It was not passive, it was active, deliberate, a refusal that radiated outward in waves. Delegates felt it like a chill rising from the marble floors, an atmospheric drop no thermostat could correct. The host technicians dimmed the room lights a fraction, hoping to refocus attention on the stage. But the dimness only sharpened the glow of the camera lamp fixed on Traoré's face. Somewhere behind the scenes, a producer whispered, "Leave it. People need to see this." Online, analysts speculated live. Was this tactical restraint, a private protest, a calculated media move? Each theory spawned threads and reaction videos, which in turn fed back into the hall through the glowing phones of junior aides. The global audience, once passive spectators, had joined the scene, amplifying the silence into a collective question mark hanging over French diplomacy. And so the first crack appeared in the immaculate veneer of the Global Forum on Africa's Future. Not a shouted slogan, not a walkout, but a gaze that drew every spotlight and exposed the orchestration for what it was. A performance built on the assumption that its audience would keep clapping on cue. In that fissure, something potent gleamed, the possibility that the narrative could shift, that the script could be seized by someone the organizers had relegated to the second row. While Dufour concluded with a final, well-rehearsed flourish, the sound of his closing line scattered like glass beads across the marble. The hall did not erupt in applause. It held its breath, waiting, not for the next speaker, but for the man who had not yet said a single word and had already convinced the world to lean in. The break between sessions was supposed to be routine, a chance for caffeine, small talk, and photo ops in front of the Grand Palais's glittering entryway. But as the French servers rolled out polished carts of espresso, canapes, and sparkling water, the air felt strangely electric. The ornate marble corridors echoed with more than footsteps and clinking cups. They pulsed with questions, murmurs, and the low hum of something quietly spiraling out of control. Journalists moved fast, not toward the buffet, but toward the French delegation. Microphones appeared like antennae from behind gold-plated columns. "Minister Dufour, any comment on the Africa debt remarks?" one shouted. "Were your words taken out of context, or do you stand by them?" asked another. Dufour, still glowing from his performance, brushed them off with a diplomat's half-smile, mumbling something about nuance and mutual respect. His aides moved quickly to usher him toward a side corridor, murmuring into earpieces, checking live reactions on their phones. Inside press rooms and among huddled panels of analysts, a different name, not Dufour's, was buzzing: Traoré. The question passed from one corner of the marble halls to the next like a rumor laced with danger. "Who is this guy? Was he even supposed to be here? Did you see that stare?" The tone wasn't derision. It was unease, the kind that follows a moment no one planned for, when the script slips and the curtain billows just enough to reveal something unscripted and powerful. At the far end of the foyer, near a pair of tall arched windows, a small knot of African Union delegates had already begun to gather. Dr. Amina Khan, the AU's official representative at the forum, stood at the center of the group, phone in one hand, whispering rapidly into another. Around her, aides exchanged glances, passed notes, and refreshed Twitter feeds. The reaction wasn't outrage, it was calculation. Something had shifted in that hall, and they felt it like experienced sailors reading the wind. A Rwandan diplomat leaned in, eyes narrowed. "If we don't let him speak now," she said, "we may lose the moment." "But he's not on the schedule," another countered. "France will block it. He wasn't even invited to speak." Dr. Khan didn't blink. And yet the whole world just watched him say more with one look than everyone else has said in 2 days. Buzzes erupted as phones lit up again. Screens showed headlines forming in real time. The look that froze the forum. Burkina Faso president breaks the internet with silence. Who is Ibrahim Traoré? From an adjacent hall, a South African advisor emerged, voice low but urgent. Addis is watching, Abuja's watching, Nairobi too. They want to know if we're going to let this pass like nothing happened. There was no formal vote, no press release, just a silent consensus that spread through the group like ink through water. Traoré needed to speak. Not later, not tomorrow, now. While the cameras were still hot and the story was still unfolding, Dr. Khan glanced toward the hallway where the moderator's office stood, then back at the group. Her voice was firm even. "I'll make the request. It won't be official, but it'll be impossible to ignore." And with that, the quiet machinery of history began to stir. Not with a bang, but with a whisper echoing through marble halls. He's not on the list, but maybe he's the one we've been waiting for. As the espresso cooled and the servers quietly cleared untouched trays, the grand architecture of the palais remained unchanged. But inside it, the forum had already begun to tilt, not toward policy, not toward protocol, but toward a man in the second row whose silence had just rewritten the first act of the story. Somewhere behind the velvet drapes of the Grand Palais, tucked in a paneled office adorned with French oil portraits and diplomatic memorabilia, Lars Anderson sipped lukewarm coffee from a porcelain cup that looked too delicate for use. As the forum's chief moderator, Anderson had spent decades navigating global summits, arbitrating high-level dialogues, and smoothing over awkward moments with Scandinavian calm. He was used to pressure, but the knock at his door that morning came with a different kind of weight. The door opened before he could respond. Dr. Amina Khan entered, flanked by 2 senior aides. Her steps were unhurried, but the intent behind them was unmistakable. She held no documents, no badge of authority, no prepared speech, just a small, folded slip of paper in her hand, and a look that said she wasn't there to ask for a favor. Anderson stood out of courtesy. "Dr. Khan," he said evenly, "I hope the sessions have been productive." Her reply was quiet, formal. "The African Union wishes to submit a time request. 10 minutes for President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso." There was a brief silence as if the air itself needed to process the request. Anderson took the note from her hand and unfolded it. It contained exactly 1 sentence, written in ink as steady as her voice. "The AU requests that President Traoré be granted 10 minutes to address the forum before the closing remarks." Anderson read it again, more slowly this time. "This is highly irregular," he said carefully. "The speaking schedule was finalized weeks ago. You know how tightly we run this program." "I do," Dr. Khan replied, her voice steady but not confrontational. "Which is why this request carries the full diplomatic backing of the AU delegation. Traoré has remained silent and respectful throughout the forum. He has made no disruptions. He seeks only 10 minutes. Anderson glanced toward the agenda on his tablet screen. "We have back-to-back closing sessions. French Defense Minister, EU Trade Envoy. The final joint statement." He looked back up at her. "And you know France will push back." "We're aware," she said. "But respectfully, the room is already paying attention to him. The world is. Ignoring this moment would be more disruptive than honoring it." Behind her, one of the aides checked his phone and leaned in. BBC Africa just ran a lead story on his silence. CNN picked it up too. Anderson tapped his fingers against the desk. He was a man of order, of predictability, and this request, this unexpected ripple, threatened the entire structure of his perfectly orchestrated program. But then again, he had felt it too. The shift, the tension, the way the laughter had curdled, The way Traoré's silence had taken up more space than anyone speaking from the stage. "How long exactly?" Anderson asked. 10 minutes, no more." He stared at the note one last time before folding it and placing it beside his cup. "Very well," he said. "I will make the adjustment. He'll speak directly after the break, before the closing sequence begins." Dr. Khan nodded once. "Thank you." As she exited the office, aides and interpreters rushed to update schedules, inform delegations, and adjust camera placements. The ripple had become a wave. Word spread quickly through diplomatic channels. Traoré was going to speak. In the hallways among the chatter of returning delegates, a subtle buzz returned. Phones pinged. Eyes narrowed. France had not yet responded, but they would. Anderson knew this decision might cost him favor with the hosts, but sometimes protocol wasn't the point. Sometimes history asked you to break your own rules. And history, it seemed, had just walked into the room wearing a second-row badge. Inside the restricted wing of the Grand Palais, far from the cameras and curated elegance of the main hall, a closed-door crisis meeting had begun. The French delegation, once basking in the glow of Dufour's moment, now sat in tight circles around glass tables, whispering urgently beneath the gleam of antique chandeliers. The air was no longer celebratory. It was calculating, cautious, and tinged with something Dufour disliked immensely: unpredictability. "He's speaking?" Dufour asked, the words clipped and sharp. His tone was not one of panic, but of disbelief. He'd just begun reviewing his press soundbites when the message came through. Ibrahim Traoré, the quiet young president from Burkina Faso, had been granted 10 minutes to address the forum before the official closing remarks. Dufour looked to his chief of staff, who nodded with discomfort. "Granted by whom?" the minister demanded. "Moderator Anderson approved the AU's request." "It's unofficial, but they pushed hard," replied Pierre Moreau, adjusting his glasses. Across the room, Marie-Claire Dubois, Deputy Director for African Affairs, tapped her pen against a folder. "We should have seen this coming. The optics of that silence, it's everywhere. Twitter, Al Jazeera, even Le Monde ran a front-page teaser. The man who said nothing, but said everything." Dufour scoffed. "It's just a media wave. Let it pass. He's not a threat. He's young, has a military background, little diplomatic polish. He won't last 10 minutes up there. This will fizzle out." "Don't underestimate symbolism," Dubois warned, lowering her voice. "They're not watching for policy. They're watching for defiance." Another aide, eyes fixed on a tablet, murmured, "Engagement on clips featuring Traoré is outperforming everything else, even your speech." Silence fell. A different kind of silence than Traoré's, but heavy in its own way. Dufour's fingers tightened around his coffee cup. For the first time in hours, the minister looked less certain. "We can't block it without looking afraid," Moreau added carefully. "Let him speak. We'll be composed. Prepared." Dufour nodded slowly, a mask of confidence settling over his face. "Very well, 10 minutes. That's all he gets. No reaction from our side, at least not publicly." But despite the tone of control, unease continued to churn beneath the surface. France had spent decades curating its image as Africa's greatest partner, investing in infrastructure, education, health. But it had also spent decades controlling the narrative. And in one unspoken moment, one still frame, Traoré had tilted that narrative sideways. Back in the main hall, the break was ending. Delegates returned to their seats, their expressions more curious than before. Some looked around as if trying to catch a glimpse of the man whose silence had become more viral than any speech. And there he was, still in the second row, still silent, still watching. His posture hadn't changed, but there was something new, a shift so subtle most would miss it. One hand now rested inside his jacket, not tensely, but with purpose, as if he were holding something. Not a weapon, not notes, but something that mattered. The camera didn't catch it, but those seated nearby noticed. A quiet movement, a hidden object, a hint of intention. Whatever it was, he already had it with him. France, for all its legacy and experience, held its breath. Because no matter how short the time, the most dangerous speech is often the one no one expected. And the most dangerous man is not the one shouting from the stage, but the one who sat in silence and made the world lean in. The murmurs died the moment the moderator returned to the stage. His voice, calm but firm, rang out across the cavernous hall with the gravity of something unplanned. Before our scheduled closing remarks, he announced, we have an additional statement granted by the request of the African Union. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso has been allotted 10 minutes to speak. The room didn't erupt. It inhaled. A collective pause like the final breath before a ripple breaks the surface. All eyes turned toward the second row. Traoré stood. No music played. No aides flanked him. No one moved to adjust the microphone or escort him forward. He rose without fanfare, without a smile, and without even glancing at the cameras that now swiveled to track his every step. His gait was steady, deliberate, not slow but not rushed. Each movement seemed to exist outside the tempo of the room, as if he wasn't walking to the podium, but toward a truth waiting to be spoken out loud. The hall was utterly silent. Some leaned forward instinctively, others held their breath without realizing it. The French delegation watched with forced neutrality. Their faces were composed, but their hands twitched ever so slightly. Nervous fingers, tightened grips. A few African leaders exchanged subtle glances, their expressions a blend of anticipation and something harder to define. Hope, maybe, or caution, or the thrill of witnessing something they knew could not be undone. Traoré reached the podium and stood behind it for a moment, saying nothing. He scanned the room, not hurriedly, not like a politician performing connection, but like someone taking account of space, of faces, of who was really listening. Then slowly he reached into his jacket. A flicker of motion rippled through the audience. Was he reaching for notes? A statement? Security detail tensed ever so slightly, but what he withdrew was neither paper nor weapon. It was a small folded piece of cloth. He placed it on the podium gently, like one might place a memory on a gravesite. Red, green, gold. The unmistakable colors of Burkina Faso's flag, creased from having been carried close to his chest. The cloth was unrolled with no theatrical flourish, but even so, it changed the energy in the room. This was not a prop. It was not for show. It was a declaration of presence, of rootedness. And then came the second item. From the same jacket pocket, Traoré pulled out a small black USB stick, unlabeled, unremarkable, the kind you might find clipped to a keychain or tossed in a drawer. But in this moment, under the heat of a dozen spotlights and 100 watching nations, it felt as significant as a sealed dossier in a spy thriller. He placed the USB beside the flag. No explanation, no introduction. The symbolism was undeniable, yet unspoken. One item represented identity, the other capability. Together they sat side by side, heritage and innovation, sovereignty and strategy. The hall had gone beyond silent now. It was locked in a kind of suspended attention, the kind that happens not when people are waiting to be entertained, but when they suspect that something important is about to happen, something that might alter the frame through which they've always viewed the world. Traoré hadn't said a single word yet, and still, no one moved. No one whispered. No one even checked their phone. He looked out across the room, his hands resting lightly on the podium, and then into the camera, the same lens he had stared into before, the one that had broadcast his silence across the globe. Now, finally, he was ready to speak. But already he had said so much. For a long moment, Ibrahim Traoré said nothing. He stood behind the podium, the flag and USB beside him, as if anchoring him in the truth he was about to release. His gaze swept the room once more, measured, steady, but not confrontational. He wasn't searching for approval, nor did he seem interested in challenging anyone directly. He was doing something far more unnerving. He was inviting the room to listen without defense. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, so calm it almost startled. Clear, deliberate, not loud, but somehow inescapable, it filled the air like a slow tide creeping in. France says Africa owes her. He let the sentence sit there, unembellished. The statement wasn't a rebuttal. It wasn't even angry. It was a mirror, held up for everyone to look into. Then came the next line, low, rhythmic, and devastating. We paid in ivory. We paid in gold, in diamonds, in rubber, in uranium that powered cities we never saw, in cocoa that sweetened mouths that never knew our names. No one moved. The hall, now fully transfixed, seemed to shrink around his voice. We paid in bodies, shipped across oceans in chains, in hands severed when quotas weren't met, in backs broken under sun that wasn't ours, in silence, because speaking meant death. His tone didn't rise. There was no rage in it. That was the unnerving part. He was reading from history, not like a scholar, but like a witness, as if these words were carved into his own memory, passed down not through textbooks, but through scars. We paid in the theft of language, in names replaced, gods forbidden, drums silenced, in borders drawn with rulers on maps made in foreign rooms, in children taught to hate their skin, their accent, their ancestors. He paused. A few in the audience shifted. One European diplomat lowered his eyes. A woman from Mozambique closed hers and clasped her hands together. We paid when our kings were taken. We paid when our rebels were hanged. We paid when our leaders were branded threats for dreaming of sovereignty. Still, Traoré's tone remained composed. But within that composure was an unmistakable tension, like a string pulled taut, daring anyone to say he was wrong. We paid in silence, for generations, in treaties we didn't write, but were told to sign, in currencies we don't control, tied to economies that don't serve us, in pipelines that never reach our kitchens, in riches exported while we import debt. The weight of his words pressed down on the room like gravity, increasing by degrees. Even those who wanted to look away couldn't, because what he was saying wasn't theory, it wasn't ideology, it was an inventory, a receipt a continent had been forced to keep while being told it owed more. We paid, in every way a people can pay. He exhaled, not a sigh, but a release, the litany complete. Then he looked toward the French delegation, not with accusation, but with clarity. And so, when we are told that we still owe, we do not answer with bitterness, we answer with memory. A long pause followed. It wasn't empty, it was full of recognition, of reckoning, of truth that had waited too long to be named aloud in rooms like this one. Traoré looked forward again, past the cameras, past the flags, as if speaking to every person who had never been allowed to speak. We have already paid. The world is just beginning to remember. For a few seconds after Ibrahim Traoré's last sentence, silence ruled the room again. But it wasn't the same silence that had accompanied his stare earlier. This one was heavier. It had shape, density, almost a pulse. No one dared cough. No one rustled a page. The Grand Palais, so long a chamber of polished pageantry, felt like it had suddenly become a confessional. Then Traoré's voice returned, quieter but somehow more intimate, almost like he was speaking not just to the room, but to something deeper within it. We have repaid every coin, with our bodies, our culture, our silence. We do not owe France. We do not owe Europe. Africa owes itself now. There was something about those 5 final words that cracked the atmosphere wide open. Africa owes itself now. The phrase hung in the air like smoke after fire, undeniable, residual, staining every corner of the room. And then, his voice cracked, just barely. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't staged. It was the kind of fracture that only happens when someone has reached the far edge of restraint, when the truth becomes too large for even the strongest composure. He caught himself almost instantly regaining control. But it had happened, and it didn't go unnoticed. The French translator's voice, up until then a steady professional stream, wavered for the first time. She stumbled over the phrase, "Africa owes itself," paused and took a small breath before continuing. The crack had echoed through the system. Across the room, a journalist from Le Monde, a woman in her early 30s with a notebook clutched tightly in her lap, discreetly wiped at the corner of her eye. The camera near her caught it, just for a moment. She wasn't African, but something had shifted inside her. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was recognition. Traoré's next words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. We owe ourselves the right to define who we are, not as a continent that waits to be saved, but as one that remembers it was never broken. No applause followed, not because people disagreed, but because they weren't sure if clapping was even appropriate anymore. This was no longer a speech. This was a reckoning. We owe ourselves dignity, not borrowed, not granted, but earned and remembered. It was as if every line he spoke was another turn of a key, unlocking doors that had remained closed for centuries. Not because no one had the key, but because no one dared try it in such a room. And to those who still measure Africa in what it lacks, I say, look again, not through your lens, through ours. Somewhere, someone in the back of the room dropped a pen. The small sound startled more than it should have. Now the room no longer felt in control. The script had unraveled. The rhythms of diplomacy, the nods, the smiles, the evasive phrasing, had all been abandoned. What remained was raw and human and irreversible. Traoré looked into the main camera again, not with the cold stare from before, but something gentler, fiercer even, in its humanity. This isn't a debt ledger, it's a mirror. And if it hurts to look, it's because the truth finally reflects back. He stepped away from the podium, not rushing, not stalling, just leaving the space with his final sentence echoing in hearts more than ears. Africa owes itself, and now the world must account for what it sees. The hall held its breath again. Ibrahim Traoré reached into his jacket with the same measured calm he had shown since the beginning. His fingers emerged not with a document or a speech, but something small, black, and unassuming. A USB stick. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, lifted it slowly into the light so every camera could see, and said, clearly, evenly, "This contains Burkina Faso's satellite defense program, developed by Burkina-Bay engineers, designed in Ouagadougou, tested, proven." Real, a sharp gasp tore through the crowd. It wasn't dramatic, it was involuntary. One of the French defense attachés shifted forward in his seat. A German delegate immediately lowered her headphones and whispered to the man beside her. The translator in the booth actually paused, hesitating for the first time since Traoré began. Phones were pulled out. Tablets tapped rapidly. Every major newsroom watching the live feed clipped the moment and blasted it onto social media with headlines that spread like wildfire. African leader claims satellite tech breakthrough. No Western aid involved. Still holding the USB stick, Traoré stepped forward slightly, not for emphasis, but to close the distance between symbol and message. No euros were used, no dollars, no yuan. This wasn't donated, it wasn't borrowed, it was built from soil to circuit by Africans. For Africa. Gasps became murmurs. Murmurs became whispers, and the whispers held fear. Not because of the technology. No one in the room knew what exactly the device contained. The fear came from what it represented, a complete break in the narrative. For decades, technology flowed one way, from north to south, always in exchange for influence, for dependency, for deference. And now? Now a young African president was standing in the center of one of Europe's grandest halls, holding up a symbol that said, "We don't need permission anymore." This project, Traoré continued, was not just a matter of security, it was a matter of belief, that we too can build, that we too can imagine systems not handed to us, but created by us. He placed the USB gently on the podium next to the folded cloth, his country's flag, still bright under the hall lights, and stepped back. "It's public. You may download it. We're not hiding our progress. We're not ashamed of our capacity. We're not asking anyone's permission to be excellent." Now the whispers turned into movement. French officials began texting furiously. An American defense analyst at the back of the room stood to leave, likely making a call. Chinese delegates leaned in, taking notes. A tech journalist live-streamed from her phone, whispering, "This is historic. You're watching a geopolitical earthquake unfold in real time." Still, Traoré didn't gloat. There was no trace of triumph in his posture. If anything, he looked heavier, as if carrying the weight of what this moment meant, not just for him, but for every African child who had ever been told their future needed foreign guidance. "We didn't build this to threaten. We built it because true security begins with self-respect." And there it was. The line that silenced even the rustling papers, even the clicking phones. Because it wasn't about the satellite anymore. It wasn't about the specs or the encryption or the orbit range. It was about the principle Africa could build. Africa had built, and now Africa had shown the world, without asking for applause. Traoré rested his hand gently on the flag, nodded once, and waited. He had just set the match, and the world was now watching the fire begin to flicker. "We built this," Traoré said softly, "with our minds, our minerals, and our mother's faith." The words didn't explode. They bled, slow and deep, into the opulent chamber, like ink spreading through white silk. The crowd, already shaken by the revelation of the satellite defense USB, was now beginning to feel the weight of something far heavier than technology, a truth long buried beneath diplomacy and donor agreements. Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every syllable landed with precision. Every pause left space for discomfort to settle into the bones of those listening. "We built this with no consultants, no imposed frameworks, no imported experts explaining how we should use our own soil. We didn't wait for a green light from Paris or Beijing or Washington. We didn't pitch it at global summits. We didn't beg for funding. We just built it." The silence was broken, not by applause but by quiet chaos. French aides began exchanging frantic glances. One whispered into an earpiece, her eyes darting toward the USB like it might detonate. Two journalists from Le Figaro rushed toward the press corridor, phones pressed to their ears, mouths moving faster than their feet. Across the African Union table, a dozen hands were texting in unison, direct lines to presidents, ministers, military advisors. This was not just a speech, it was a breach, a rupture in the narrative they had all rehearsed. Traoré remained still, steady. "Our minerals were always taken," he continued. "Gold, cobalt, uranium, coltan, extracted and exported. But this time we use them here. We refine them here. We turn them into something that serves us, not powers another's empire." He glanced slowly across the French delegation, not with venom, not with triumph, but with something deeper, something closer to truthful mourning. "You say Africa owes you," he said, echoing Dufour's earlier line. "But tell me, what did you build for us that didn't require us to give more than we received? What did you give that wasn't first taken?" The emotional center of the room cracked. A journalist from Belgium put her pen down and stared at her notepad like it had betrayed her. A translator's voice trembled slightly as she reached the end of a paragraph. Even the opulence of the Grand Palais began to feel like a museum of misplaced pride. Its chandeliers suddenly cold, its mirrors reflecting uncertainty. "We built this because we had to. Because if we kept waiting for validation, for funding, for permission, we would wait until we forgot how to believe in ourselves. And we're done waiting." The words weren't bitter. They were sober, grounded, clear like the ring of iron striking iron. In the French delegation's private channel, a red message lit up. "This is destabilizing. Contain it." But it was too late. The air had changed. The power dynamic flipped. Ibrahim Traoré had just told a room full of global decision-makers, "We no longer need your systems to survive." He hadn't come to tear anything down. He had come to show what was already rising, built quietly, steadily, independently. And now that the world had seen it, it couldn't be unseen. Traoré lifted the USB once more between finger and thumb, turning it so the lights overhead glinted along its plastic edge. His voice, when it came, was composed, almost gentle, the calm that follows a storm only he seemed to anticipate. "You can download it," he said, and the simplicity of the offer sliced through the tension like a clean blade. "There are no patents to negotiate, no licensing fees, no hidden clauses. We believe in cooperation, not permission." He lowered the stick toward the folded flag, paused a heartbeat, then released it. The sound was barely audible, a soft click of plastic meeting lacquered wood. Yet the symbolic weight landed with a thud that everyone felt. Flag and flash drive, roots and wings, dignity and design, history and horizon, pressed together on that polished podium for every camera to witness. One of those cameras obeyed an instinct older than journalism itself and zoomed tight, filling screens worldwide with the juxtaposition, the vivid red-green-gold cloth in the stark black rectangle. Instantly, screenshots ricocheted across timelines. Technology meets identity. Africa's new manifesto in two objects. Download dignity. The hashtag flag and flash ignited within minutes, vaulting to global trending in 3. Meme architects went to work, overlaying the image with bold captions. Not for sale, built here, permission denied. A Nigerian influencer streamed live commentary to 500,000 viewers. He just dropped a seismic file on colonial economics. Fam! Literally dropped it. Inside the hall, however, the gift felt dangerously close to a dare. French advisors mouthed silent instructions to aides. Secure a copy, verify, spin. A U.S. delegate texted Washington, "Need cyber team on Burkina file, ASAP." The Chinese trade envoy slipped out, phone all ready to ear, tone urgent. Yet no one dared step forward and physically take the USB. Its presence was radioactive, priceless and perilous all at once. Touching it first might signal endorsement, or worse, dependence. And so it sat, small and unassuming, pulling the room into its gravity. Traoré watched the hesitation spread, a quiet knowing in his eyes. Collaboration, he reiterated, soft but unyielding. Not extraction, not obligation. If you wish to work with us, work with us. If not, the download button is still yours to press. We will move forward either way. For a split second, the chandeliers overhead seemed to dim, not literally, but in the perception of everyone present, outshone by the brighter light of possibility the little device implied. A ripple of realization passed through the African contingents first. Heads lifted, shoulders straightened, back row seats suddenly felt front row. This wasn't a closed vault of secrets, it was an open door. The future wasn't arriving with bowed head and outstretched hand, it was standing upright, offering a shared blueprint. On stage, Traoré's 10 minutes were nearly gone, yet time appeared to stretch. He placed a palm lightly over the flag, an almost tender gesture, then withdrew it. No grand flourish, no final rebuke, just that unbeatable pairing left in plain sight. Identity laid beside innovation, an invitation laced with challenge. The moderator, throat dry, stepped forward to signal the session's close, but the hall ignored him for a beat longer, every gaze magnetized to the podium. Outside, phones vibrated in cascading waves as push notifications flooded devices. CNN breaking, Burkina Faso releases satellite defense files to public. Al Jazeera, Africa offers tech without strings. Le Monde, le geste qui défie Paris. The world had seen the drop. Now it had to decide what to do with it. And in the hush that followed, one truth was unmistakable. The USB was free for anyone to copy, but its real value lay in whether anyone had the courage to accept what it demanded in return. Cooperation without control, partnership without permission. The speech had barely ended when the aftershocks began rippling through the city. As diplomats shuffled into the networking lunch with plastic smiles and pulsing anxiety, the real response wasn't happening inside the Grand Palais. It was unfolding across screens, in phones and whispers, in a digital avalanche that no press secretary or protocol officer could stop. It started with a single tweet. A 22-year-old student at the Sorbonne posted a grainy screenshot of Traoré's face, unblinking, unwavering, fixed on the camera, with the caption, "For once I'm more proud of Africa than of my own government." The post was quiet, raw, unpolished, and within 20 minutes, it had over 300,000 retweets. By the hour's end, university students across Paris were resharing the clip of Traoré dropping the USB beside the folded flag, setting it to music, adding slow-motion effects, overlaying quotes like, "We owe ourselves," and "cooperation, not permission." These weren't just posts, they were digital brushfires, igniting something buried deep in the youth of France. At Sciences Po, a philosophy major stood atop the central courtyard steps, megaphone in hand, quoting from Traoré's speech word for word. "We paid in silence. Now we owe ourselves the truth." Dozens of students circled around, nodding, some crying. They weren't African. Most had never been to the continent. But something about the dignity, The unshakable composure of that man on the podium pierced straight through inherited narratives. By nightfall, spontaneous gatherings erupted at the gates of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Cardboard signs read, "We owe ourselves. Partnership, not patronage." Who really owes whom? The protests weren't angry. They were something more dangerous to systems of control: reflective, sincere. The chants weren't aggressive. They were questioning. Why do we only listen when power speaks? Why do we fear dignity? Media outlets scrambled to contain the tide. Conservative pundits dismissed the movement as a misguided youth rebellion. State officials called it a misinterpretation of diplomatic intentions. But by the time morning newspapers printed their rebuttals, the hashtag "We Owe We Ourselves" had crossed borders, trending in Berlin, Madrid, Lagos, Nairobi, São Paulo. A student leader at the University of Lyon live-streamed an open mic event titled "Voices We Were Never Taught to Hear." The video featured French, Algerian, Cameroonian, Haitian, and Senegalese students sharing personal stories of colonial erasure, followed by a projection of Traoré's speech onto the facade of the university building. In perfect silence, hundreds stood in the street and watched. Somewhere in the 14th arrondissement, a retired professor watched the coverage and whispered to himself, This is what 1968 felt like, but global." French political advisors weren't prepared. They had planned counter-statements for diplomats, not teenagers with TikToks. They had contingency memos for African summits, not philosophy students citing post-colonial literature. But what made the movement so disarming wasn't its organization. It was its awakening. The youth weren't demanding power. They were demanding clarity, demanding a reckoning. And as the days passed, the signs only grew bolder, the conversations more nuanced. From cafes to classrooms, Traoré's 10-minute speech was being dissected with the intensity of a cultural manifesto. In one viral clip, a young French student of Moroccan descent stood in front of the camera and asked, "If a man from Burkina Faso, with no entourage, no press package, no permission, can challenge a century-old narrative with just his stare and his truth, what excuse do we have for silence?" The camera panned up behind her to show a growing crowd behind the ministry, arms linked, voices rising in one unified chant. "We owe ourselves." And with that, the revolution had left the marble hallways of diplomacy and entered the public square. Not through riots, not through force, but through a mirror held steady, long enough for an entire generation to finally look into it and see something they could no longer unsee. While the streets of Paris pulsed with chants and the internet burned with fragments of Traoré's words, thousands of kilometers away, the political center of Africa was shifting. Inside the African Union's headquarters in Addis Ababa, the lights in the executive chamber stayed on deep into the night. An emergency meeting had been called, officially labeled a closed strategic session, but no one in the building doubted what it was: a response to a moment no one could ignore. The hall was quieter than usual. No media, no press corridors, no ceremonial openers or rehearsed statements. Just 45 heads of state and senior defense advisors, seated in a horseshoe of polished wood, eyes trained on one name written at the top of the day's only agenda: Ibrahim Traoré. There was no debate over what had happened in Paris. Everyone had seen it, many of them not in official briefings, but forwarded from nieces, nephews, or staffers who had watched the live stream on Instagram or WhatsApp. They saw the USB. They saw the flag. They saw the words that Europe had no answer for. And now they had to decide, was this an anomaly or a beginning? President Tandia of Senegal was the first to speak. He didn't address the hall. He addressed Traoré directly, who sat near the end of the table in a dark, understated suit, without an entourage, without a single note in front of him. "You stood where most of us have stood before," Tandia said, "but you said what we never dared. You didn't just speak for Burkina Faso, you spoke for all of us." A pause. "Now let us act like it." What followed wasn't a fiery debate. It was more like a gentle unlocking. One by one, voices rose, not competing but converging. Angola, Rwanda, Ghana, Mali, Kenya. Even historically cautious Algeria nodded its assent. No one was asking for a miracle. But everyone knew the opportunity they faced. A vote was proposed, not for symbolic solidarity, not for applause, for coordination. Within an hour, the African Union had approved a rare, accelerated motion. Traoré was to be appointed lead coordinator of African defense innovation, a new, unprecedented position that would centralize regional technological development, prioritize homegrown defense initiatives, and, perhaps most critically, break dependence on foreign contractors and private defense monopolies. The vote passed nearly unanimously, only one abstention, no objections. It was the first time in AU history that such a decision had been reached in a single session. As the resolution was read aloud, Traoré remained seated, unmoving, but those closest to him noticed a subtle change. His hands, previously folded together, opened gently on the table. Not in triumph, in readiness. "This isn't about weapons," said President Nyalungu of South Africa, looking across the room. "It's about who owns the tools of peace, the tools of sovereignty." The AU's announcement went public before dawn. Social media lit up again, not with shock this time, but with validation. This wasn't one man's story anymore. It had become a shared arc, an African pivot point. Hashtags evolved. Hashtag Africanswers, hashtag from silence to strategy, hashtag unity. Not dependency, news outlets across the continent began calling the appointment a Marshall Plan in reverse. Young Africans flooded forums with ideas, suggestions, volunteer signups. In Accra, a group of university engineers launched an open-source platform overnight titled We Build, inviting technologists from every member nation to collaborate. And the message was clear. We will not wait to be rescued from systems designed to keep us dependent. We will rescue ourselves together. Unity was no longer a diplomatic ideal. It was becoming a strategic necessity. And behind that shift, without intending to lead a movement, stood the man who had once sat in the second row, silent, watching, and carrying a USB in his jacket pocket that had just reprogrammed the direction of a continent. By the time morning fog curled over the Seine, official Paris had already prepared its answer. France's foreign ministry held a swift, tightly scripted press briefing. Standing at the podium was a stone-faced spokesperson, flanked by tricolor flags and the seal of the Republic. There was no mention of the USB, no reference to the protests or the AU's emergency vote. Only a cold line of defense delivered with rehearsed certainty. President Traoré's speech was unauthorized, inappropriate, and potentially destabilizing. France remains committed to constructive engagement with Africa, but this kind of unilateral rhetoric threatens to undermine years of diplomatic progress. The words echoed through wire services. Destabilizing, dangerous, unauthorized. The subtext was clear. Traoré had not just broken with protocol, he had violated an unspoken agreement. Speak only when permitted, build only what is monitored, and above all, never inspire unrest. An aide followed with a second statement, implying that France would reevaluate its aid structures and security cooperation agreements with Burkina Faso if this aggressive posture continues. It was a diplomatic threat dressed as concern. But outside the halls of power, nobody seemed afraid. In fact, they weren't even listening. Young Europeans, particularly students and second-generation immigrants, responded not with loyalty to the old guard, but with defiance toward it. Within minutes of the press briefing, a new hashtag exploded across social media. Hashtag unauthorized hope. An artist in Marseille uploaded a mural in progress on an old concrete wall, Traoré's profile emerging in spray paint beside the words, "We owe ourselves." In Amsterdam, a street musician played audio clips of Traoré's speech between violin improvisations, drawing a crowd that clapped not at the music, but at the pauses, at the memory of those 10 minutes that had already outlived the marble grandeur of the Palais. And across digital platforms, headlines from global outlets offered a far different framing than the official European stance. BBC, a USB and a flag, the revolution that didn't need guns. Al Jazeera, the silent revolution, Africa speaks, the world listens. The Guardian, from Paris to Ouagadougou, one man redefines power. In editorial columns, journalists marveled not just at what Traoré had said, but how he had said it. Without aggression, without demands, without applause-seeking, just clarity and consequence. He didn't need to shout, wrote a columnist from the Times. His quiet conviction carried more weight than any summit declaration we've seen in decades. France is still rooted in the reflexes of old diplomacy, tried to contain the moment as if it were an outburst, a fluke, a glitch in the system. But this wasn't a glitch. It was a new operating system. Across EU capitals, whispers began to stir. What if France had overplayed its hand? What if the old tools, control, funding leverage, veiled threats, no longer worked? What if Traoré had done something far more dangerous than antagonize? What if he had awakened respect? And perhaps most threatening of all, what if he had given people, both in Africa and in Europe, a new image of leadership to believe in? Back on social media, the phrase spread like fire in the dry brush of long-held frustration. The silent revolution has begun. Not in noise, not in chaos, but in a voice so still it had made even empires lean forward just to hear. In the weeks following Ibrahim Traoré's seismic speech in Paris, the world's diplomatic tone began to shift, not in grand declarations, but in quiet, calculated signatures. First came Turkey. Their delegation arrived in Ouagadougou without press, without ceremony, just a team of engineers and advisors carrying proposals, not conditions. Within 48 hours, a joint research accord was signed, focused on space defense cooperation, sustainable drone technology, and cyber training. No loan agreements, no colonial hangover clauses, just exchange. Then came Brazil. President Andrade, flanked by Afro-Brazilian scientists and youth tech leaders, delivered a message live from São Paulo. We do not reach out as donors. We reach out as descendants, as peers, as partners in a shared future. Her government signed an innovation pact with Burkina Faso, focusing on AI for agriculture, open-source educational platforms, and decentralized communication networks. The subtext was clear. Brazil had found a mirror in Africa's rise, not a rival. Finally, South Africa, long a continental heavyweight, moved decisively. Not only did they ratify a defense cooperation framework, they proposed something bolder: the Pan-African Sovereign Innovation Grid, a decentralized network of tech hubs, data centers, and R&D labs connecting capitals across the continent. Not under UN oversight, not under foreign cloud servers, owned and run by Africans. Within days, the African Union ratified the proposal. The announcement came from Addis Ababa in a voice that was calm, confident, and distinctly different from the cautious tones of the past. We are not asking for a seat at someone else's table. We are building our own, and it has no head, only room. 3 cities were chosen to launch the grid: Nairobi, where the first AI-enabled defense protocol would be tested; Dakar, now home to a cross-continental data sovereignty research lab; Accra, which had already begun retrofitting existing university spaces into public innovation studios with glass walls and open floors, designed for students, engineers, and soldiers to collaborate in real time. The labs went live in one coordinated press stream. No gala, no ribbon cutting, just 3 synchronized feeds from East-West and Central Africa, each showing the first teams plugging in devices, booting up servers, writing code. Screens flickered to life. Digital maps of the continent emerged, lines of encrypted network paths glowing like veins under a black canvas. Africa, not as a landmass, but as an active system, alive, awake. Traoré, for his part, did not appear in the broadcast. He didn't speak. Instead, his voice was heard reading a short statement, pre-recorded and played over footage of the labs coming online. We build, not to catch up, but to reach outward from where we already stand. The world is not ahead of us, it's beside us, and now it sees us clearly. The reaction was immediate. Journalists called it Africa's moonshot moment. International think tanks scrambled to update forecasts. Investment firms sent quiet inquiries. Some European governments offered thinly veiled offers of technical assistance, but found that their emails were politely, diplomatically ignored. Back on the continent, university bulletin boards overflowed with applications to the new tech labs. Young engineers who once dreamed of visas to Silicon Valley now dreamed of contributing to something rooted in Nairobi or Accra. The labs didn't promise instant prosperity, but they promised something rarer: agency. And as that agency began to harden into systems, servers, and sovereign code, a new kind of architecture emerged, one not made of marble or money, but of networks, trust, and memory. Not everyone celebrated. Some still waited for it all to collapse. But inside the labs, beneath the buzz of machines and minds, Africa was no longer reacting. It was designing. If the labs and alliances were the bones of a new Africa, then the art, music, and literature that followed were its beating heart. Almost overnight, a creative eruption swept across the continent. It didn't begin in government ministries or corporate boardrooms. It started in cafes, on street corners, in college dorms, on TikTok, in open mic nights and graffiti-covered walls. The energy was raw, untamed, but focused. There was no manifesto, just a shared pulse. We are no longer waiting for the world to give us permission to feel proud. In Lagos, a rapper known only as Nkosi dropped a single titled "We Owe Ourselves," layering Traoré's voice over a dark Afrobeats rhythm. His lyrics were sharp but visionary, blending defiance with vision, memory with momentum. Not made in China, not born in France. I come from fire, I don't ask to dance. My passport ink is innovation. My mother's name? Liberation. The track went viral in less than 12 hours, not just in Africa, but across the diaspora. In Johannesburg, young poets stood in circles, trading verses not about suffering, but about sovereignty. A new language was forming, not from dictionaries, but from liberation turned inward, then outward again. In Kinshasa, filmmakers began rewriting scripts. Gone were the tropes of trauma and tragedy. A new cinematic movement emerged, dubbed Afro Now, which centered futures not defined by scarcity, but by invention, resilience, and self-authorship. The first breakout film, The Code Beneath Our Soil, told the story of a teenage Burkinabe coder reverse engineering surveillance software while caring for his grandmother. It premiered at film festivals across Africa, then stunned European audiences when it won Best Direction at Venice. For the first time, African cinema wasn't merely invited, it was central, not tolerated, but celebrated. Across literature, the shift was just as profound. In Nairobi's oldest bookstore, Savannah Lines, a previously unknown author's debut novel, sold out in days. Titled The Stare That Shook Empires, it fictionalized Traoré's Paris speech. But it wasn't just about him. The protagonist was a girl from rural Togo who taught herself code on a broken phone and ended up cracking into a forgotten colonial archive. The novel was translated into 9 languages within a month. All of it, music, words, imagery, was part of a wave that could not be manufactured. It was not curated. It was uncontainable. Even fashion turned revolutionary. In Dakar, a young designer named Aminata Diallo launched a clothing line called Rememory, using recycled military fabric to create bold modern silhouettes that reimagined national identity through texture and thread. Her designs didn't hide the past. They wore it like armor, turning remnants of conflict into statements of possibility. From Kigali to Cotonou, murals bloomed on walls that had once carried colonial colors. They no longer depicted chains or broken maps. They showed satellites, circuit boards, ancestors holding books. One painted phrase became almost sacred, whispered like a prayer and shared like a challenge. We were never voiceless, just unheard. For decades, African identity in global media had been framed through pity or pain. Now a generation was refusing both. They weren't erasing history, they were claiming authorship of it. From school children reciting poetry in Swahili and U, to diaspora kids in London and Atlanta rocking #WeBuild hoodies, a new story was being told. One where Africa was not the place that needed saving, but the place where salvation through creativity had already begun. It wasn't a cultural revolution led by institutions. It was 1,000 brushstrokes, verses, beats, and camera lenses all pointing in the same direction, towards self-definition. And for the first time in generations, children across the continent weren't being taught to imitate. They were being invited to imagine. In conference rooms once defined by hierarchy and scripted diplomacy, Something new was beginning to unfold. The system, slowly, reluctantly, was learning to listen. At the United Nations, the change didn't start with speeches, but with silence. During a high-level roundtable on global development financing, a representative from Kenya paused her remarks, folded her notes, and simply said, "We will no longer speak only for the record. We will speak for results." The room, long used to hearing African delegates frame arguments within donor-friendly vocabulary, felt the shift immediately. There was no applause, just attention. Behind the scenes, changes began quietly. A UN task force on digital infrastructure agreed to pilot an African-authored framework, originally drafted in one of the Nairobi Innovation Labs launched under Traoré's Continental Initiative. Instead of reviewing Africa's needs, the plan centered Africa's capacity. It proposed equal tech transfers, mutual standards, and respect for data sovereignty. Within weeks, over a dozen countries signed on. At the World Bank, similar tremors emerged. The institution, once infamous for top-down development prescriptions, announced the formation of a new advisory panel on localized innovation, staffed entirely by African economists, engineers, and education leaders. Their first report, "Growth Begins Where Assumptions End," pulled no punches. It criticized legacy models of aid, spotlighted decades of intellectual extraction, and called for reparation, not in cash, but in policy space and decision-making power. The message was clear. Africa would not simply participate in global systems, it would reshape them. Meanwhile, the IMF, under pressure from its own credibility crisis, took a step that would have been unthinkable just a year before. For the first time in its history, it invited 2 African central bank governors and 1 fintech founder from Ghana to sit on its long-term economic policy steering board. These weren't ceremonial seats. They came with real influence, real votes. And the first resolution they pushed through? An independent audit of IMF lending practices across sub-Saharan Africa. Some saw it as a threat, others recognized it for what it was. Long overdue accountability. And then, perhaps most surprising of all, Europe responded. Not with condemnation, not with whispered pressure, but with something unfamiliar. Measured respect. It started small. France reopened lines of communication with Burkina Faso, this time led not by diplomats, but by education ministers and university researchers. A quiet collaboration began on open-access scientific publishing, with French institutions offering to co-host platforms authored and managed by African scholars. No branding, no conditionality, just bandwidth and access. Germany followed suit. Their foreign minister traveled to Nairobi, not to lecture, but to listen. She spent 2 hours off camera in a small room with 10 African climate scientists and didn't speak until the final 15 minutes. When asked why, she replied, "Because you're not just stakeholders, you're architects now. I came to learn how you're building." Even Brussels began to recalibrate. Trade envoys arrived in Accra proposing value chain partnerships, not just raw resource contracts. European companies looking to secure rare earth materials were now required to include local ownership and training plans, a condition quietly inspired by the Traoré Doctrine, which had swept across AU documentation like fire through dry brush. Of course, not everyone adapted. Some power players bristled at the shift. Legacy NGOs accustomed to acting as middlemen found their relevance fading as African governments launched direct civil tech platforms. A few donor nations still tried to repackage control in new rhetoric, but the difference now was that Africa recognized the tactics and said no, without flinching. The system hadn't changed overnight. It hadn't reformed out of guilt or enlightenment. It had simply realized something more powerful than moral pressure, that a continent once treated as a recipient was now acting as a standard setter, and that those who refused to listen would be left speaking only to themselves. This story isn't just about a man named Ibrahim Traoré. It's about the power of presence in a world addicted to noise. Traoré didn't overthrow anything with weapons or rage. He stood still. He stared. And in that silence, he exposed centuries of imbalance without saying a single word. His journey from quiet observer in a French forum to catalyst of a continental shift reminds us that dignity is not granted by others. It's realized within. The story shows us what happens when a person, a nation, a people stop waiting for validation and begin building their own definitions of worth. What moved me most was how the ripple of one man's restraint became a revolution, first through technology, then through culture, then through systems that once refused to change. In a world that often demands volume to be heard, Traoré proved that clarity, courage, and conviction speak louder than any shout. This is a story about Africa, but not just for Africa. It's a story for anyone who's ever been overlooked, underestimated, or told they must wait their turn. Because when you stop asking for permission and start believing in your own voice, something remarkable happens. The world listens, even if it doesn't want to. Now I'm curious, what about you? Have you ever had a moment where silence said more than words? Do you believe quiet courage can truly reshape the world? Let's talk about it in the comments. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.